Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of the world's oldest alphabet in the dating of the Exodus with doctors Tony Costa and Douglas Petrovich. If you guys haven't watched the first two videos, I encourage you to do so, where they go through the Sinai inscriptions 361 here, which is on the screen, and I actually forget off the top of my head what the other Sinai inscription was. It was 374, I think. Or 376, I'm not sure. But he goes over another Sinai inscription and he details how the early alphabetic inscription is in fact the world's oldest alphabet, which, according to his argument, Dr. Petrovich's argument, is Hebrew. I, of course, would disagree with that argument, along with many other scholars like Falk or Kenneth Kitchen or Dr. Hoffmeyer. So, if you haven't watched the first two videos, I encourage you guys to do so. In the third video here, we're going to talk about the Exodus, the dating, how this reflects the dating of the Exodus in his argument. And we'll see what we go from there. A couple of key notes, though, or a couple of notes here before I'd like to continue with the video here, is one of them is, let me see if I can bring this up here. No, I do not want that. We're going to minimize that. We're going to go to this. So here, if you guys cannot see, is an alphabetic list here of the Paleo-Hebrew script and the Phoenician script. Now, I made mention in my last video or the video before that the evolution of the alphabetic scripts, when early alphabetic script, that's roughly 2000 BC to 1300 BC, then you get the Phoenician script, which is somewhere around in there 1300 down, and then you get the Paleo-Hebrew script, which is a descendant of the Phoenician script, and the Phoenician script is a descendant of the early alphabetic script. And I did make mention that Colston makes the argument that there were other languages that used different scripts in his article, which you can find in the second video I did. The last video I did, I think I went into that. But if you've noticed here, the Paleo-Hebrew script and the Phoenician script, and you notice how similar these scripts are. And if you go back into the scripts that Dr. Petrovich went over, if you look at if you remember, it was on the far right, it listed, the script looks similar to Paleo-Hebrew or Phoenician. It could go either way. So my point being is that it seems to be conjecture on Petrovich's part to just put these letters side by side with the early alphabetic script and then run with it. That's the whole crux of my, that's part of the problem that I have with his argument, is he seems to be just running with it here in this interview. So, yeah, that's what I think about that, at least with his argument here. So we'll just go ahead and fire it up, and then we'll continue with the video here. We'll just let him finish, since I already basically gave my thoughts on Sinai inscription 361 here. So we'll move on from this. We'll let him conclude, and then he'll start talking about the Exodus. He actually brings up Dr. Falk and David Roll and the patterns of evidence production that was made by Tim Mahoney. So without further ado, here we go. Part 3.
Astonishment. Wow. There are frogs all over Egypt. Wow. There are locusts pouring into our country. They're all over. That's what he did. He provoked astonishment. Then let's step back and maybe make a more general statement. Not only did he, here or there provoke astonishment, but this continued on and on. It is a year, a Shana, a year of astonishment. That makes sense too, because Christian scholars tell us, who really have never studied Egyptology formally, to know how long this would have gone on, right? This period of the 10 plagues. But they tell us it was about a year. wasn't a day or two, or it wasn't a week or two. It was about a year for all of this. Well, what do you know? This inscription says it was a year of astonishment. What was? The 10 plagues on Egypt. So what do they attribute it to? Do they attribute all of this to Moses, or to the God of Moses? Who's the God of Moses? And remember, Moses asked, okay, God, who do I say sent me?
Mm-hmm.
God said, tell them I am has sent you. Oh, I am. Yeah, I am. So that's what he told them. The name of our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is I am. So whoever wrote this inscription, Tony, did not ascribe credit for these 10 plagues that caused this year of astonishment. Didn't attribute it to the God of Moses or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because remember, this is all new to the Hebrews. They don't know personally and experientially that the
Right.
God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob convinced them that he is true, the true and living God. So
Right.
they attribute this to the lady. Who's the lady? The word here is Baalat. That's the
Right.
feminine version of Baal. We know
Right.
about Baal in the
Yeah.
time of the kings. That is the male storm god who is connected to the fertility goddess. So his spouse, if you will, his deity spouse is Baalat, that we
Right.
know of as Ashereth.
Right.
So that's the lady. It's Asherah.
And he's right here. I'm sorry, I've just got to interject one small thing. He's right about this. Ashereth is the consort for Baal, but if I'm not mistaken, all throughout the Old Testament, she's always called Ashereth, never Baal, never Baalath. So I just want to make that clear.
So this Hebrew person is attributing credit not to God for these things, but to this pagan deity.
Right.
You know what, Tony? That shouldn't surprise us,
No.
because it says in Jeremiah, God himself speaking retrospectively. Yeah, back when you Israelites were in the land of Egypt, I made myself known to you, and you were worshiping foreign gods.
Mm.
Right?
That's because there were no Israelites at the time. Now, what do I mean by there were no Israelites at the time? Since I'm a late date Exodus holder here, during the late Exodus, you had, let's back up here. And I think I've gone over this in other videos too on critiquing early date Exodus, the view of the early date Exodus in my other videos. But back it up to right before the New Kingdom, the Hyksos ruling from Avaris in Lower Egypt, which I think the archaeological excavation site is Tel El Daba, or Ed Daba, whatever. So there you had the Hyksos, and they were driven out by the Egyptians. But there were still some Amorite Semitics or Amoritic Semites, whatever, in that area still. And that's when they forced them into slavery labor, to build the store cities Ramses and Pithom, or Ramses and Pithom. Okay? That's what's going on. And they were pagan idolaters. They shouldn't really say it like that, but they were polytheistic is what I'm saying. They were polytheistic. They worshipped several gods. Moses was included in this. Moses was a polytheist. He worshipped several gods before his encounter in Midian with Yahweh in Exodus 3. So, and we're going to elaborate on this a little more later in the video. This is why I'm bringing it up now. So, yes, they were polytheists, but there were no Hebrews yet, as we've come to know them. It was a mixed multitude, as the writer of Deuteronomy would say. It was a mixed multitude of people. You had Libyans, you had Egyptians, you had Nubians, you had all sorts of people in this mixed multitude, hence the name, mixed multitude. And they were polytheists. They worshipped several gods. That's what the writer of Jeremiah was alluding to when he wrote that. These guys were polytheists, and it wasn't until their encounter with Yahweh in the Sinai Peninsula that they finally became monotheists, as we use the term today. So, I'm not really sure why Petrovich is making this sort of argument like that. When the descendants of Abraham were there. The tribes were there. You know, the 12 tribes, the 12 sons, and then their descendants were still there. But there was so much more going on here than just the descendants of the 12 tribes. You had a mixed multitude, as the writer of Deuteronomy said again. So I just want to make that clear now.
Well, here it is. Proof in the pudding.
Right.
They're before God, Ba'alat, that they were attributing credit to for this astonishment that Moses provoked that caused this year of astonishment. Isn't that amazing?
That's incredible. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I'm just really impressed at the fact that we know the name Moses, as you know, Doug. Moshe is not Hebrew. It actually, it came from Hebrew lettering, obviously, but it was given that name by the daughter of Pharaoh. She named him Moshe because he was drawn out of the water. And I think there are some variants in some of the pharaohs, like Thutmose, for example. I think there are some variants of that name among the Egyptian pharaohs.
Yeah. Amos, Thutmose.
Right. But that's amazing that we actually have something outside.
Now, theoretically here, before they continue, I just want to make a note here on the term Moses. They're absolutely correct. Moses is of Egyptian origin, but normally what happens, especially in the New Kingdom, is that they would attach a deity's name to Moses. So Moses actually had a deity name before it, and after his encounter with Yahweh in wherever Midian was, whether that's Sinai or on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba, wherever he had his encounter with Yahweh on Mount Sinai, they dropped the deity's name when he started worshiping Yahweh. So just a side note there.
Side of the Bible, an extra biblical attestation to the prophet, to the great lawgiver Moses.
Yeah, and it becomes an extremely important inscription to help us to establish a credibility for what Moses would write, right? The first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, which, remember, and you know this as well as I do, being at the U of T.
Yeah.
Professors around the world are teaching in universities that there was no historical Moses who wrote the first 5 books. It was written in the 600s, 500s, 400s, whatever, 300s BC by this slew of authors who somebody came.
And he's hinting at, if you guys don't know already, he's hinting at the documentary hypothesis here, which Petrovich doesn't hold to, by the way. Neither do I, but that's a different topic for a different day.
Came along, compiled it all together, and we have all these writers who've contributed. Well, guess what? This inscription, if I'm right, and between me and you, I'm right. If I'm right, this blows the documentary hypothesis out of the water. That's why I and my book are lethal to secular scholarship today.
Right. That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, when I was studying at the University of Toronto, Wellhausen and his documentary hypothesis was being taught. One of my professors, I don't know if you remembered Professor Revel. I don't know if you remember Professor Revel, no. But he wasn't really a big fan of the documentary hypothesis. And so he was beginning to see its weaknesses and the holes in there. But no, this is fascinating stuff. We have just a question here, if I can bring it up, Doug. Yeah. This is a question here from Thesarevin. What does I'm assuming he's referring to you, Doug. What does he think of Dr. David Falk's view?
Yeah, and it's interesting. David Falk and I studied together. He was in a 1-year MA program at U of T, and I had just started my PhD. We were in, I think it was my Middle Egyptian text class, 2nd year of my 3 years in Egyptian language. And we started out as fast friends, and David Falk basically, I became like anathema to him when I told him I was of the early Exodus view, and he's a late Exodus subscriber. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of just colored our relationship. I always tried to treat him as a friend still and as a colleague. And as far as I'm concerned, we believe in the same Bible. We don't need to be at odds with one another, but he never really had any interest in giving any credence or credibility to any of my work. And basically, he's kind of made it a goal to convince people that everything I have to say in this realm has to be futile, has to be wrong, has to be error plagued, and and so forth. And it's interesting. It's been an interesting experience for me because a lot of this has been done in public. A lot of it goes beyond simple scholarly disagreement to personal attacks and so forth. But I have to just kind of let all that go, and that's that. But yeah, I don't agree with his view on.
Let me just stop it here because he's going to continue a little bit longer. And I'm not going to try and... Dr. Falk can defend himself on this issue. And he's actually brought it up on his channel a couple of times. And I don't know about the personal drama stuff, so that's not even for me to say. So I'll just be silent on that issue. But absolutely, Dr. Falk and Dr. Petrovich do disagree on the Exodus dates. Dr. Falk being a late date like me, and Petrovich being an early date like Dr. Kennedy. But I did want to mention that oh shoot, I forgot what I was going to say, guys. Imagine that. Anyway, it must not have been important. We'll just let him go on, but I do just want to mention that they do have different views on the Exodus. Moving on here.
On the Exodus timing, and therefore that colors a lot of his understanding. Many of the things that he has to say, I'd agree with 100%, and he does excellent research on many things. Mm-hmm. But whenever the date of the Exodus comes into play, and it forces him to kind of bend the shape of his thinking to mold to the late Exodus view, then he kind of he loses the ability at objectivity and dealing with evidence as he should as a trained scholar with a PhD. So I personally expect more of him. That's the bottom line. I expect more of him. And I'm hoping someday he'll agree.
Right.
And he'll kind of see the light. But, I've tried my best, and it just really hasn't gone the way I was hoping yet.
Right. So what do you think is the main obstacle here, Doug, among some of these academics? Is it because there's a narrative that they've been taught and they've so entrenched into that narrative that they're not willing to let it go? Or is it because, do you think it's, let's face it, we know that as Christians, we know that there's a tendency within fallen sinners to push back against God. There's a tendency to rebel against his word and so forth. Do you think that the problem here is that you think there's an anti-supernatural undercurrent playing here, an anti-biblical inspired Bible view here, where the Bible has to basically adapt to, a humanistic framework ex eventu, that these things were written after the fact, and there's a lot of fiction and redaction that's gone into the text. So, because one of the things I'm thankful to God for, Doug, is that when the Lord threw me into the University of Toronto, I sometimes say that he threw Daniel into the lion's den, and he threw me into the critic's den. And so a number of my professors, I remember, they were amazed that at the end of my master's program, some of them couldn't believe that I was still conservative. They actually said, I can't believe that you're still holding to these conservative views. They thought for sure that redaction criticism, form criticism, and all the other forms of literary criticism, they thought for sure they would have broken me. But I remained steadfast. And and in fact, I thank God for that, because it's just strengthened my confidence in the scriptures. And so what do you think is the undercurrent here?
And Tony, what those professors didn't come out and tell you outrightly is it was their intent to pull you out of your faith in the historicity of the Bible. So
see, I'm not so sure about that. I don't know if that, some of them maybe, but I wouldn't lump all secular academics into that basket, if you will. I wouldn't say all secular academia wants to just draw you away from that. I wouldn't say it's everyone. Again, this is just conjecture. This is just yeah, just conjecture on Petrovich's part, I think, to go after secular academia on this. Um, it is my personal experience that I've never experienced this. It's my personal experience that I've never encountered that sort of thinking. Have I met instructors in my who aren't Christian? Yes, I have. I have. But I'm not going to come out and say, because I don't know with any measure of degree or accuracy, if they were actually purposefully trying to bring me away, draw me away from Christianity. I really don't see that. And to do so is, it's not, honestly, for lack of a better term, it's not really honest. It's not really good. It's not really wise to say that, in my opinion. But anyway.
So that because you now don't believe in the historicity of the Bible, you all of a sudden have to scratch your head and say, if I can't trust the historical message, can I really trust the spiritual message? And that's a valid question.
Yeah.
If the history is all goofed up,
yeah,
then what does it tell you about the spiritual message? Can you really trust it? So, yeah. So I would say this. For those kinds of people, yes, it's option B, where there's a spiritual dynamic and they're fighting against the Spirit of God. They're fighting against the convicting Spirit of God, who would, if they would bend the academic knee and say, yes, all this has to be historical, and all of a sudden they would say, wow, then that has further implications. Now I have to deal with the spiritual message in the Bible. But my conscience says, it's so seared. I say to myself, I have no desire to change anywhere, anything where I stand on this issue, because now I have moral obligations that I'll have to change my life. I'll have to change the way I live. Some of my practices I'll have to change. Some of my views I'll have to change, and I don't want to give up all of that. I don't want to be responsible to this deity people are proclaiming, and that this Bible is alluding to, and that its historical messages is affirming. So it helps them in that way. But with someone like David,
bear with me here, guys. I know this is just the they aren't getting to the Exodus, but I assure you they will get to the Exodus. I'm sorry for the lengthy discussion about spirituality and why secular academics do what they do, I guess, if you will, and Dr. Petrovich's reaction to that. So bear with me. We'll get to the Exodus, I assure you.
David Falk, I would say it's option A, where, and in this case, there's a scenario here that comes into play very seriously. It's considered only acceptable in the greater academic world to say that if there ever was an Exodus, if the Israelites ever did live in Egypt, the Exodus had to happen in the middle of the 13th century BC.
And again, there were no Israelites. They were Amoritic Semites living in Egypt. A mixed multitude of people living in that area. And that left, it was a mixed multitude of people that left Egypt in the late 13th century, or in the 13th century. So.
And that being the case, let me say, it goes back to the work in the 20th century by an archaeologist, mainly, and more in a popular sense, by the work of an archaeologist named William Albright. And Albright came along, and he was a real bouncy, bubbly personality, and people just kind of believed what he said. He was so strong of a speaker that they all just fell in line with what he said.
I really wouldn't say they just all fell in love with him as a speaker and that they just believed whatever he said.
And what he said was, look, we have no evidence of Israelites in in Canaan from 1400 BC to 1200 BC. Therefore, if there was an Exodus, it had to happen in the 13th century BC, because only then can Israelites live there. And then we also have this Merneptah stela.
Yeah.
It gives us evidence of, and I would date it to 1219 BC, evidence of.
I date it to 1209.
of Israelites in Canaan and interacting with the Egyptians toward the end of the 18th dynasty, showing us that they were around, and not in Egypt, but in Canaan.
Right.
And that's even more evidence added to this to support Albright's position. And so basically, everybody.
Notice what he said here. He's absolutely right. The Merneptah Stele is, I think I've showed this in a previous video, is both a Merneptah Stele and the Merneptah Stele dates to roughly 1209, depending on who you are. And it lists Israel. And then the determinative after Israel is people. It's not a land determinative, is my point. So it's got the determinative for peoples. So it's not a nation, it's just a people group. Which sort of supports the late date in that they were wandering still in the wilderness. They hadn't settled yet in Canaan. They were almost there on the backside of the desert. And when the Egyptians encountered them, according to the Merneptah Stele. So that's where he's getting this.
Everybody kind of just had to fall in line with that. Oh, if there was an Exodus, it had to happen in the 13th century BC because archaeology demands it. But you know what, Tony? What they failed to say is, oh, and by the way, there's also virtually no evidence per se of Israelites in Egypt from 1200 BC to around 1000 BC. And now we have a little bit more, so we can go further back in time before 1000. But for the most part, we have no evidence of Israelites in the material.
Because there weren't Israelites in Egypt. It was a mixed multitude. You had the descendants of Abraham, yes. But they were not called Israelites yet. Not until the 13th century. When they were not in Egypt, but in Canaan. Or approaching Canaan. More or less, they were probably in Canaan, in my opinion, but...
material culture either. So, markers such as the four-room house and all of this. So, because of that archaeological...
The four-room house didn't appear in Canaan, by the way, until the early Iron Age. In Canaan, I mean, in the Levant. In Egypt, I think there is evidence at Tel el-Dabba of a four-room house, but it didn't appear in the Levant until the early Iron Age.
Historical background. It now becomes this pill that you have to swallow and to become part of the fraternity. And if you believe in an early Exodus view, which by the way, the early Exodus view is the view that takes the numbers in the Bible seriously and literally.
Oh dear. He takes these numbers literally, which is a red flag to me. Now, some of the numbers you can take literally, but you can't just take every single number in the Old Testament literally. We'll go in a little bit here and a little bit, we'll dive into it in a little bit here because Petrovich kind of hangs on to this. And then he goes into 1 Kings 6:1, which I've got up, and we'll go through it here in a minute.
And it will take you back to 1446 BC. And so, again, if you follow the archaeological evidence that people have been telling us and swallowing that pill, then you have to say, okay, it can't be that the Exodus took place in the 480th year before the beginning of the building of the temple under Solomon. It has to be that number 480th, which it's not 480, by the way.
Right.
It's 480th, an ordinal number. And ordinal numbers, as Casuto has proven, you may know this, cannot be used allegorically or figuratively. So it has to be a literal number, the 479th. It's 479 and 480th is 479 and change.
Right.
So it has to be literally and has to go back to the middle of the 15th century BC. Right. So that's kind of how it works.
Right. And the sad part is that there's good scholars out there like yourself that...
Okay, I'm going to stop it right here and we'll talk about the years, if I can here. Here it is in the Hebrew. 1 Kings 6:1. And I know what he's trying to say. It's because it says here. Let me bring up the. I'm sorry, guys. I thought I had the ESV up for Kings. Here we go. Or we'll bring it up. I get it? No, I didn't. I can't type. Huh. There we are. So it says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. So it is a cardinal number in English, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it literally. Even the person he cited. As other scholars have mentioned, like Falk and some Assyriologists, sometimes certain numbers have some sort of special meaning to them, some sort of idiomatic or special meaning to them. In Babylon, it was the number 60, which was an important number to them. In biblical, according to the Israelites here, or the people who would become the Israelites, it was the number 40, or the number 4, which just means a long time. So, and if you add numbers that are divisible by 40, it just only means that it's a really long time. That's really all it means. You see this with Acts, and I think we're going to go into this a little bit too in a little bit, but Acts 7 mentions that Moses was in Midian for 40 years, whereas Exodus, it's not even mentioned. So that's one point, is that it just means an extremely long period of time. You see this in Judges occurring over and over and over again after 40 years. The people, 40 years, there was a judge that reigned for a certain amount of time, and then there were 40 years of which God gave them over to a foreign ruler, and then they were oppressed. You see it over and over in Judges. Now, what's interesting as well here I want to mention is if you look at 1 Kings 6:1, and it reads, in the 480th year, that's what this says. I don't want that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Shoot. Well, I made a boo-boo. I didn't want the apparatus. Shoot. No, that's the... So, let me go bring this up again. I just made a slight error here. Come on. Oh, here. It's down here. Oh, it's down here. Sorry, guys. Didn't see it. So, we'll do this. Let me see if I can exit out of some of this stuff. There we go. Okay. Here we go. So, if you look at the apparatus here, I'm going to do some text criticism on 1 Kings 6:1 here. So, in the Masoretic text here, it reads in the 480th year. Okay? If you look here, the G here, this fancy G here with the L, the Septuagint, which is the Septuagint, and then the L, which is the Lucian recension, adds 440 years. So it would be in the 440th year, which is still a multiple of 4, if you will, or at least of 12, just like 480 is, which means just an exceptionally long period of time has passed. So, which one is it? Is it 440 years or is it 480 years? I know that's a 40-year difference. And there is some sort of, give or take 10 years, 5 or 10 years because of ancient history, and knowing how so little archaeological evidence or even textual evidence exists. But you have the Septuagint with a different number. So which one do you take literally? And if you're off by 40 years, that can be problematic. So, getting back to the text or getting back to the discussion here, I just wanted to make that point there.
Would not be given a tenured position in, let's say, Yale or Harvard or the University of Toronto if you held to these views. They would think you're way too conservative and too right wing and so forth and so on. So, unfortunately, a lot of students end up having to, like you said, just take the pill and just go with the narrative, and that's sad because it violates their conscience, I think, and also your convictions
Yeah.
as well.
And can I tell you a quick little story that's it's fascinating? When I was working on my PhD at the University of Toronto, and you know how this works.
Sure.
The administration, your advisor, and your department, and at the end of it, your dissertation committee, they're like the Pope and all the cardinals, right?
Yeah.
They have all the power. They can do the thumbs up, like
Caesar,
like zero,
yeah,
or thumbs down.
Yeah.
And so all of these findings that went into my first book and my second book, and so there's the first book, and here's the second book, the new book. Origins of the Hebrews, New Evidence of Israelites in Egypt from Joseph to the Exodus, which basically gives all of the evidence that I came up with to prove that Israelites lived there for that 430 years the Bible says they did. But all of these discoveries,
even that number, 430 years, can be taken differently. As far as the sojourn in Egypt, does that mean is both Canaan and Egypt, or is that Egypt only? So that can be taken a couple of different ways as well.
That during my PhD studies, God was dropping me. I refer to it as dropping me into one gold mine or pot of gold, one pot of gold after another, discovering an inscription with Moses' name. You got to be kidding. Joseph's wife. You got to be kidding. And it just goes on and on, right?
Yeah.
I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg. But in the midst of all this, I couldn't tell people at the University of Toronto. Why? Because they would find a way not to let me graduate. And I didn't tell them. Actually, in secrecy, I've told a few things to my advisor, Tim Harrison, the son of missionaries, and he kept that. And I was thankful that he kept that secretive. But apart from that, I kept it quiet. And I defended my dissertation, I got my PhD, and then I published my book. And as soon as I published my book, the one most scathing of all scathing reviews of my book was put out by the Hebrew professor at the University of Toronto who was on my dissertation committee. And he was not happy at all.
Wow. Incredible.
Yep.
Incredible. Did you want to say something about the dating of the Exodus, or do you have a PowerPoint on that? Or
yeah, I do, but do you want to take so much more time now that we're an hour in?
Well, do you want to maybe do a bit of a summary on that, or if anyone has any questions, by the way, you can put a question in the chat. If you put a capital Q there in the chat, I can pick that up and ask Dr. Petrovich. But unless you just want to do a summary, I'm being mindful of your time too, Doug. I don't want to go over. We've already done an hour, going on an hour and 10 minutes. So, did you want to say something in summary? I guess a summary form of.
Yeah, and if you'd like, we can always do a follow-up, a second interview at some later point.
Sure, absolutely,
and go into more detail there. But yeah, a lot of that argumentation is found within my book. I published a journal article in 2006 in the Master's Seminary Journal, my first published article on Amenhotep II and the historicity of the Exodus Pharaoh, and I kind of update that in a chapter in the book. And essentially with that, and this is just one angle to help support this idea that the Exodus happened in the 15th century BC and not the 13th century BC. But part of that is identifying the Exodus Pharaoh. Now, the Bible doesn't name him. Moses doesn't name him. Why? Moses followed typical Egyptian historiographical methodology, meaning it was the prevailing practice of the day for writers, for scribes, not to include, in Egypt, not to include the name of the foreign king or authority figure who was opposing the Egyptian king. You just don't name him. You can call him by a title, but not a name. So Moses followed that protocol. But we can know, I think, who that Exodus Pharaoh is
I will say though, I just want to add something here to this. The idea that the king was called Pharaoh or Per-Ah, which just means great house in Egyptian, dates to Thutmose III. And it was a sign of respect, and people would say things like, it's almost it's the equivalent of saying, oh, the White House says, or if you're in the UK, the Crown says, things like that. That's what it was. It wasn't customary to put the name of the pharaoh, the name of the king, after pharaoh. It just wasn't up until the first millennium when they started including names of the kings of Egypt, like Shishak or Shoshank is the other name for it. So I will say that. So
because there's so much very clear and decisive um, a set of requirements, I should say, that basically will eliminate candidates left and right. Because whoever your candidate is, he's got to meet all of those requirements. It's kind of like in the old Israelite world, right? If you claim to be a prophet, what percent do you have to be right to stay alive?
100.
Yeah. 99? What about that?
No.
You're done.
Yeah.
They kill you. They stone you to death. So you have to get it right. So where was I going with this?
About Moses and the foreign king. He would not mention the
I've been there before. I know the feeling.
foreign king.
Yeah.
And you're eliminating various candidates for the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Right. So if you fail, if you're that's it. If you're a candidate for the Exodus Pharaoh, or I'm presenting someone as a candidate, and he fails at one of those requirements, let's say his oldest son ends up on the throne as the next king after this guy, right? Or all of a sudden you have to go, bzzz, doesn't work. You have to eliminate him from possibility because he fails in that one requirement. Another requirement, his predecessor, the Exodus Pharaoh's predecessor, has to be on the throne over 40 years.
Why, though?
We know that.
But why does the predecessor have to be on the throne for 40 years? Who made that rule?
From combination of what we read in Exodus with what we read in the book of Acts. Very clear. He has to have been on the throne for at least 40 years, because it's after those 40 years.
And that goes back to possibly meaning a long time that we just went over in 1 Kings 6:1. Now, Exodus doesn't even mention, if I'm not mistaken, how long Moses was in Midian. Now, I'll beat him to it. He's going to talk about this here in a minute, but about the predecessors. Before Ramesses II, you had his Seti I, who reigned roughly 11, 12 years, I think. And then his father, Ramesses the first, reigned only 2 years. And that's just because he was already old when he ascended the throne. And Horemheb, the last king of the 18th dynasty, produced no heir. So you had the succession crisis in Egypt at the end of the 18th dynasty. And Horemheb is like, look, I'm not having children, don't want children. I guess this is just me speculating here. He didn't want children, for whatever reason, he didn't have children. But he named Ramesses the pharaoh, the next king in succession. So that's how the 19th dynasty started. So, but I just don't understand why there must be a precursor for the predecessor of the Exodus, of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, that he must have reigned for 40 years. I get Acts chapter 7, which is what he's using to prop up this argument. In Acts 7, you have Luke, the writer of Acts, saying, I think in 730, that Moses was in Midian for 40 years. But the book of Exodus makes no distinction, if I'm not mistaken, on how long Moses was in Midian. And again, we've already gone over 1 Kings 6:1 that says 40 is a number that just means a long time. You see this in Mesopotamia with the number 60, and you see this in the Hebrew, in the Jewish texts, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, with the number 40. So
that the guy dies, and the Exodus Pharaoh takes over. So that eliminates a lot of candidates right away. And the candidate that people want to prop up for the late Exodus view for the Exodus Pharaoh is Ramses II.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the deal. His predecessor, I forget how.
I wouldn't so much say the ego. As far as Ramesses II being the pharaoh of the Exodus, I would say that it fits in with the text and the archaeological evidence. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you have the storage cities, Pi-Ramesses, or Pi-Ramesses, however you decide to pronounce it, and Pithom. Now, Pithom is the Egyptian word for Per-Etum, which is Per-Atum, which is an Egyptian god. Then you get Per-Ramses, which is the house of Ramses. And Ramses didn't really... The name came about in the cities, weren't really constructed until the late New Kingdom. Like, later than the 15th century New Kingdom. So that's a bit problematic for an early date of the Exodus. And they ceased... I can't remember when they were no more. But my point is that these two storage cities that are listed in Exodus, and we have archaeological evidence that Pi-Ramesses or Per-Ramesses was 2 kilometers away from Avaris, which helped solve the problem of propinquity, if I pronounce that word right. Which is again problematic for an early Exodus date, because the 18th dynasty ruled from Thebes, while the 19th dynasty ruled from Pi-Ramesses, which was the capital. So that's a bit problematic for the early age of the Exodus as well. But the name Ramses existed in the late New Kingdom. 19th dynasty is the thing. That's what I'm trying to say. And I don't think we have evidence of Pi-Ramesses existing prior to the 19th dynasty.
How many years? 16 or 19 years his predecessor ruled.
Right.
But
before he goes on here, I just want to make the clarification. I just want to clarify, I am not an Egyptologist. So if I do make a mistake, at least in regard of Per-Ramses, maybe if Falk is watching or another Egyptologist is watching, please correct me. But it's my understanding that Pi-Ramesses namely Pi-Ramesses, did not exist prior to the 19th dynasty, maybe late 18th. So
Ramses himself ruled into his it's insane, 67th year or whatever it was. Some exorbitant.
Surprisingly, that I know. Ramses II reigned about 67 years.
Renal length. So you've got it all wrong if you're picking an Exodus pharaoh on this basis from the 13th century BC. You've got to go with the son of Ramses II, which, by the way, is Mer-Neptah. And remember, the Mer-Neptah stela says that Israelites are in Canaan during his reign. So that eliminates a 40-year wandering in the desert. So the late Exodus view dies a horrible death if you're going to really take seriously the requirements in the biography of the Exodus pharaoh. And so I'd put this out to my colleagues who are late Exodus advocates. Show me how your candidate is not eliminated by one or more of the stringent requirements of the biography of the Exodus pharaoh. Show me. And, prove it to yourself first. And, put your view on trial. Put your candidate on trial. And if he fails, then eliminate him from your list of possibilities and go on to someone else. And what I try to prove in my book is, hey, if you take all those seriously and you look at them objectively, only Amenhotep II of Dynasty 18 fits all of the measurable requirements of the Exodus pharaoh, at least the ones I've been able to come up.
So Amenhotep II,
yes,
you believe is the pharaoh, would have been the pharaoh of the Exodus based on that criteria.
Yes. And we can...
I would like to add here, I don't think I mentioned this in the first two videos, was when Pharaoh loses some of his chariotry, it wasn't his entire chariotry, and Pharaoh did not die. He lost a majority of his chariotry, which sort of weakened the military, the Egyptian military at the time, and made it ripe for foreigners to come and invade, like the Libyans did during the reign of Merneptah, I think it was, and then the Sea Peoples when under the reign of Ramesses III. It weakened the Egyptian army severely. When Pharaoh lost a portion of his chariotry during the Exodus, which sort of fits well with the late date. So
you can look at his reign more carefully when at a later time we do a second look into this issue of the timing of the Exodus.
Absolutely. And so I like what you said there, Doug. I never really knew that you talked about how Moses did not record the name because it would have been, can you explain again the criterion why Moses would not have mentioned the Pharaoh by name? Because you said something about it being a foreigner.
Sure. So in the middle of the second millennium BC, which is Moses' lifetime, remember, mostly the 15th century BC, he lives. At that time, the practice of Egyptian scribes who worked under the command of the Egyptian king, or what we call Pharaoh, they consistently followed a practice, which was not to write down in their documents, in their historical documents, not to write the name of the foreign king or ruler who opposed the Egyptian king in the battle or whatever the conflict was that scribe is writing about. Right? You don't include the guy's name. And that's consistent across the board. Now think about this. If Moses is raised as a prince of Egypt, he's got to know Middle Egyptian, right? Number one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can prove it, but he's got to know it. But number two, even if he doesn't,
more than likely he knew Egyptian.
Either way, he's got to at least have seen some of the work of the scribes who were writing things down in Egypt. And they were writing in such a way that they weren't including the names of the foreign kings that Pharaoh was fighting. That being the case, Moses would have had this in his ear and in his mind. Okay, the normal thing to do when you're writing about a foreign king is you don't name the foreign king. So when it comes time for him to compose the Bible, the Pentateuch, what does he do? He follows what he learned from watching the scribes. It's really very simple.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so when you say the foreign king, are you talking about enemy kings or?
Yes.
Okay. So enemy kings. Okay. Yes. Good. Okay. And so if you can maybe, Doug, in patterns of evidence, when they talked about the dating of the Exodus, was it something, I mean, whoops. I think in one of your tweets,
there we go. Sorry, guys. I'll comment a little bit on the patterns of evidence stuff, and then I'll probably just end the video because this goes even further and further and further in. I might actually have to make a fourth one, but now that I'm thinking about it, I might just end it here because we're going on an hour, and I kind of want... I muted it accidentally, I see. There we go. I kind of want to save this little... It's not even enough. It's like 20 minutes. Oh, well, we'll see how far we get. If we don't get through it, that's fine. I'd like to get through the patterns of evidence stuff and then end this series here, but we'll see how long it goes.
You said you had some criticism with Roll's position.
Oh, yeah. I disagree with David Roll.
This might be our point of agreement here on David Roll, by the way.
More than you can shake a stick at. And I'm very, very, very grieved at the influence that his work has been upon the Christian community that is not trained in Egyptology. I can't tell you how much consternation has been created in me as a result of seeing this influence. So yeah, I agree. I disagree with him on a lot. Someday I'm hoping to write either a journal article or a book that attempts to refute a lot of his positions so that people can be woken up to this. But the average Christian who has a high view of the Bible falls into David Roll's writings and sees that, wow, this guy, he's willing to stand alone. And you know how we work as Christians. We're supposed to stand alone. That's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So we're attracted to what he's doing and his style. But the bottom line is, number one, he doesn't even have a terminal degree, so no PhD. As far as I know, he doesn't have a master's. He only has a bachelor's degree in Egyptology. So he's officially not a scholar.
Right.
But he's writing books and speaking from the position of authority and as if he were a scholar. And for the Christian community, you need to know this. He's a self-proclaiming atheist.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, think about that one for a moment. In a public forum where a bunch of people were writing back and forth, he criticized me in front of all the other people and said, it must be such a terrible, to paraphrase, it must be such a terrible thing that you are constricted by this thing called inerrancy, that you don't believe in errors in the original writings of the Bible. Right. So if you're...
And it sounds like Roll has a fundamental misunderstanding on the doctrine of inerrancy, which, in my experience, again, here I'll say a lot of people have a misunderstanding on inerrancy. But that's another issue for another day.
If you're a Christian listening to me now, think about that one for a minute. Let that one sink in.
Yeah.
Are you going to trust a person who has such a low view of the Bible and is willing to criticize those with a high view of the Bible? You're going to trust that person in an area of history where you don't have training. And all I can say is be extremely careful with what he says. There are others, so not only I, but Bryant Wood and Charles Ailing and Scott Stripling and others. We all together, and Roger Young, we all wish that Tim Mahoney, the Christian filmmaker, would not have kind of like, the Pied Piper, listen to the tune of the pipe and just followed the piper. Yeah. With David Roll. But remember, Tim Mahoney, and he's a dear friend, he's not a scholar either.
No.
Mm-hmm.
So, I understand.
And honestly, I really have to agree with Petrovich on this one. Patterns of evidence is woefully mistaken and misled by David Roll on the Exodus. Now they want to cut out some 300 years of history, and that's no, absolutely not. No scholar on the planet, no ancient Near Eastern scholar on the planet would do that. That's problematic for me. Again, like Petrovich said, Roll only has a BA in archaeology, in Egyptology. He has no terminal degree. So why he's writing books on the subject is beyond me as well. Absolutely agree with Petrovich on this. And unfortunately, the success of that first film that Mahoney made led him to make another one, The Moses Controversy. And then it led him to make a third one, The Red Sea Miracle, I think is the name of the third one. And it's just one film after another of misleading people into thinking that it's an early date of the Exodus. And it's just not simply so. The early date of the Exodus.
Why he maybe wouldn't know all the reasons why not to be mesmerized by David Roll's teachings. But the bottom line is, we wish, and we've gone to him and we've said, Tim, you need to walk away from this. But he didn't.
Yeah.
And to date, he won't.
Yeah. Well, it just seems like, and I found that very strange that Roll's a self-professing atheist, and yet Christians are listening to him, and yet he doesn't believe that God spoke to Moses, and God not only spoke to Moses.
It's not his atheism that really is problematic for me. It's his lack of a graduate degree, like a master's or even a terminal degree, as Petrovich says, like a doctorate or something. I think that's problematic. to me.
Moses, but that God sent the plagues and miraculously delivered them out of bondage and so forth. So it reminds me of that author of, remember the Bible codes? Remember back then we had the Bible codes?
Yep.
And I think it was Dresden, I believe it was. He wrote a book called The Bible Code, and he's a self-professing atheist as well. But he made thousands upon thousands of dollars on the sales of his book. And so I mean it's just very strange that you've got self-professing atheists who are becoming superstars in the Christian community talking about something like you said that are not credentialed in this area. And a bachelor's in Egyptology just doesn't cut muster. I mean, you need a lot more than that to be an authority in the area. So
Right.
I see your point, and it's very well taken. And I think there's just something in evangelical Christianity, Doug, that there's this mesmerization that Christians become just mesmerized with people, and they're not discerning enough to probe deeper.
Right. And we have to do that. It's like, let's say I have a degree in chemistry, a bachelor's in chemistry or something, and I say, I've found a cure for most cancer, right?
Yeah.
And let's say, Tony, you're just diagnosed with a certain form of cancer, and it's one of the ones that my drug apparently fits. Mm-hmm. So and this is serious, right? They find that you're in whatever, 3rd stage or 4th stage cancer, and you need to work on this and get it solved if you're going to live. Are you going to go to people with, advanced degrees in the medical community who've been working on this for their whole lives, with their work based on the work of others who've spent their whole lives working on this, to treat your cancer? Or are you going to go to me, the guy with a BA in chemistry, who says, hey, I found this, wonder drug that will cure cancer, will destroy the cancer cells? Are you going to come to me, or are you going to go to them?
Well, obviously,
when your life's on the line.
Yeah, to the professionals, obviously, the medical professionals.
I think I'm going to stop it here, because I think they just talk about this stuff. But on the whole, to conclude my concluding thoughts on this, at least as far as the Exodus part's concerned, since we've already discussed the early alphabetic scripts mostly, is that since I'm a late date proponent, I just think there's a lot of evidence for the late date, and there are several problems for the early date, such as the problem of propinquity, which I mentioned earlier, because the 18th dynasty ruled from Thebes far to the south in Upper Egypt, whereas by the time you had the dynasty switch in Dynasty 19, you had the ruling family of Egypt ruling from Pi-Ramesses, which is where their family actually originated from, is in that area, is in Lower Egypt. So there's that. You have the weakening of the military, the Egyptian military, the chariotry in particular, which opened up Egypt to invasion, once by the Libyans and the second by the Sea Peoples, though they successfully defended Egypt from these foreign invaders. It's severely weakened the Egyptian military in the process. You have the wandering in the desert for 40 years, and then they arriving on the backside of the Levant. And then you have the Merneptah stele, which mentions Israel by name, with the determinative, the people determinative, instead of the land determinative, which means that this was a people group that had left Egypt and that escaped or left Egypt, or whichever word you want to choose, and then arrived on the backside. These are just some of the problems. I do go more in depth on the Exodus video, on the Exodus in a couple other previous videos on my channel, if you'd like to check those out. I can leave a description in the bottom if for you to find it easier, or you can just look and search on my channel. I don't have a lot of videos up yet, so it should be rather easy to find it. So, like I said, we're going to end it here. This concludes the series as well, since they're going to go on about role and everything. So I'll end it here. And then I won't let the cat out of the bag as far as revealing the next reaction video, of course. But if you stayed to the end, give yourself an attaboy, a pat on the back. And don't forget to like and hit the subscribe button if you like the content and more. And I will see you guys in the next video. So take care.